Okay, everyone, welcome again to the Kirkwood Center podcast for Theology and Ethics. My name is Anthony Costello. I am the president of the Kirkwood Center. I am joined today by Lenny Esposito, my vice president at the Kirkwood Center. And we have an excellent panel put together today. We have some PhD scientists on our panel, some PhD philosophers, to tackle what is, I think, a very significant and controversial issue going on in the natural sciences right now in the area of origin of life research, or what's often called, in this case, abiogenesis. And we're going to be talking about a debate that occurred in November. I believe it was a November 28th debate at Harvard University between the eminent chemist, synthetic chemist, Jim Tour, and an origin of life researcher by the name of Lee Cronin. Okay. And before we get into the issue and what occurred at that debate, we're going to go through around the panel here and get some introductions. So Brian Miller, let's start with you. Just give us a short introduction. And then, like I said, we'll go around the horn and have everybody say a little bit of something about who they are and what they do.
Yes, I'm Brian Miller. I have a PhD in complex systems from Duke University. So I had studied a lot about non-equilibrium systems, and that's really how I became interested in the origin of life. And I'm currently a research coordinator at the Discovery Institute and a scientific fellow there.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And actually, let's do all the Discovery Institute guys first. So we'll go to Casey next. Casey, can you give us a little rundown?
Yeah, my name's Casey Luskin. I'm Associate Director of the Center for Science and Culture at Discovery Institute, where I work with Brian and Steve Dilley. My role there primarily is I help to direct our research program and also do a lot of advising of scientists and academics who are being persecuted because of their views on intelligent design. And at the moment, my computer is freaking out. I don't know why, but it seems like the control button is permanently pushed down and I can't unstick it. I don't know what's going on. So
well, you're coming in loud and clear. So I guess it's not
affecting the audio.
Anything.
Yeah. Just use a hammer, Casey.
I would really like to right now. I'd like to go Office Space on it, actually.
All right. Well, Steve, let's do you next, since you're colleagues with Brian and Casey at the Discovery.
Yes. My name's Steve Dilley, PhD in philosophy. Been with Discovery for 2 years. I'm a senior fellow and the academic center's mentoring coordinator. In a past life, I taught philosophy at a university and have since transitioned to Discovery. So fantastic to be part of the team.
Okay, and Owen Anderson at Arizona State University, who I also think you and Steve have a connection.
Yeah. It's great to see Steve again. We went to graduate school together in philosophy, and I'm now a professor of philosophy and religious studies at Arizona State, and I do some work in philosophy of science, and so I'm excited to be here today and talk about this debate and some of the ideas that came out of it.
Yeah.
Laughing a little bit because I'm looking forward to examining some of the things that were said there.
Yeah, indeed. And as we show some of these clips and go through it, I think there is reason to sort of chuckle at.
I'm only a humble philosopher, but
well, it's great. Again, we got two people with science backgrounds and two with academic philosophical backgrounds here. So I think this is going to be super relevant to what we saw on November 28th, where there was clearly an intersection of science and philosophy going on there. And we have to touch on some of those issues. Okay, so Brian and Casey, I kind of want to start with you guys to set up the audience before we get into the debate proper. I want you guys to give us maybe a little bit of history, a little background story on what is going on. What is origin of life research in this context? Who is Jim Tour? And what has he been doing recently to sort of kind of upset the apple cart here within this origin of life research community? So I don't know who wants to start, Casey or Brian. You want to jump in and maybe give us some background?
Brian is the expert on the origin of life, much more than I am. So I think Brian should tee the ball for us here.
Certainly. And just to give you some background is Jim Tour is one of the world leading researchers on how to create nanoscale machines that perform such actions as killing cancer cells or attacking bacteria or many other purposes. So he is considered an ultimate expert in how do you actually go about creating a very complex molecule that can perform some task, like a molecule that looks like a car that can drive along a track. And several years ago, he started to hear about origin of life research and the claims by the field. And essentially, the challenge of origin of life is explaining how simple chemicals on the early Earth could have come together and coalesced in these very complex molecular machines. And he realized, reading the research of these professors, that their claims were a bit exaggerated, because he knows how hard it is to create a molecule for a purpose, a very specified molecule. And what he realized is the way these researchers were doing it was they were using extremely complex laboratory protocols, multi-steps, changing conditions in a highly orchestrated way. So he realized, but from his expertise, that this could never have any parallel on the early Earth.
Nobody has ever made these compounds with the absolute stereochemical purity that's needed using prebiotic chemistry. Never been done. Nobody has ever shown that the mixtures found in meteorites or interstellar space could be useful for synthesis. Nobody has solved the mass transfer problem. This is a big problem. How much material do you need to go from A all the way to Z, the cell? How much material? You go through a synthesis, you run out of material. You got to go back and make more starting material. You've been going along now 400 million years making stuff, now you've run out of material. Well, go back and make more in the beginning. I can't go back because I never kept a laboratory notebook. I'm just a dumb early Earth.
And he realized that the key scientific issues related to the origin of life were never being addressed. Like, how do you actually create the building blocks of life, like amino acids and nucleotides, in sufficiently high concentrations and purities that would allow them to come together in a useful way? Also, no one was addressing, even if you had the high concentrations of these molecules, how do they form into long, complex chains? And how do they gain the right information to perform the right functions? And finally, he realized they were never addressing, even if you had all these little molecular machines and building blocks, how could they come together in a coherent fashion to maintain a functional cell? So he has basically done a series of videos explaining how origin of life researchers have not addressed these key issues, and they're not even on the right track.
Yeah, right. Casey, do you have anything to add that, you've seen over the last couple of years as Jim Tour has been challenging these origin life researchers? Anything else you want to add to what Brian just said?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Jim Tour has also gotten into a number of entanglements with sort of popular expositors of the origin of life, the pro-origin of life view. I think Brian mentioned that Jim is a professor of chemistry at Rice University. So he really is a renowned chemist. He's published hundreds and hundreds of peer-reviewed papers. He's very well respected in the scientific community as an inorganic, synthetic, actually, I'm sorry, not as an inorganic, but as a synthetic chemist. He is really an expert on how to make things. And he's done some fascinating research producing these nanomachines that actually can drill holes through cell walls to help target cancerous cells or antibiotic resistant cells. And he's really done groundbreaking work in a number of different fields, looking at trying to produce better methods of creating graphene, which is a form of carbon that can help many materials applications. So, he's quite world renowned. So when he decided to enter this origin of life debate, he got a lot of attention from folks like Professor Dave, who is a well-known YouTuber, who is sort of a materialist and an expositor of the pro-origin of life view. So as Brian mentioned, he's making these videos, and he's also attracted attention from detractors. And so back in May of 2023, Jim did a debate with Professor Dave at Rice University. Jim actually helped to host that. It was quite a fiery debate. I'm sure we can talk about that a little bit more, but I think we covered this debate extensively on evolutionnews.org at Discovery Institute, having some reviews of what the different parties said. In that debate, basically, Jim Tour came and focused strictly on the science. And Professor Dave came and focused strictly on Jim Tour, attacking Jim Tour personally with really an unending series of vicious personal attacks, going after Jim in just the most vicious, nasty personal ways. I think the consensus about everybody on the internet is that whether or not you agreed with Jim Tour, you know, at least he came and focused on the science, and Professor Dave really came simply to attack Jim Tour personally and said that he would enjoy doing so. So it kind of exposes where he is at, you know, wherever he's coming from. It's all about attacking people more than anything else. So I think that when we saw this debate or this roundtable that Jim Tour had with Lee Cronin at Harvard University, we were really interested to know, well, how is this going to go? Is this going to be similar to the Jim Tour Dave Farina debate where a lot of fireworks were going off, or is it going to be more civil, subdued, et cetera? And I was very pleased to see that actually the roundtable at Harvard where Jim Tour dialogued with Lee Cronin was much more civil and thoughtful, and I would say focused on the issues. Now, that having been said, and we'll talk about this more, I do think that ultimately, you know, the debate dynamic was not entirely different, and that Jim Tour came to the roundtable at Harvard focused on the science, and ultimately, you know, his opponent spent a lot of time talking about Jim Tour and the rhetorical dynamics of that debate rather than actually answering Jim Tour's questions. But I want to say this. I think that Jim Tour has posed a lot of very credible scientific challenges to the origin of life community, and asking reasonable questions about whether or not they are going to be able to explain how the origin of life took place. And his questions really have focused on how do you create the key biological molecules that must somehow be synthesized under prebiotic Earth conditions. We're talking about polypeptides, polynucleotides, and polysaccharides. And then he also asks, how do you account for the origin of specified information in those molecules? And then how do you assemble all those components into what he calls an integrated functional living system under natural, primitive, Earth-like conditions? And I want to say one thing, although Brian really is much more the expert in this topic, he's got a PhD in physics, and he really understands the thermodynamics behind the origin of life and what really goes into these questions. I actually do have a bit of a background myself. When I was an undergraduate student at UC San Diego, I had the opportunity to actually take seminars from Stanley Miller, who was at the very tail end of his career at that time at UC San Diego. A lot of sort of, you know, folks that are in the twilight of their careers like to go to San Diego for their end stages of retirement for obvious reasons. And so UC San Diego attracted scientists like Stanley Miller or Francis Crick or Leslie Orgel. And I had the opportunity to hear seminars from these amazing origin of life researchers as a student there, and also took courses from Jeffrey Beta, who was one of the proteges of Stanley Miller. And he was actually my professor, and I learned origin of life from him in a course. So, you know, I do have a bit of a background in this, and I felt very blessed to have been able to study from some of these folks. And so I hope to be able to share a little bit about, you know, unfortunately, their ideas about the primordial soup are kind of outdated these days, but, you know, still it's relevant to the conversation.
All right, great. You know, Steve and Owen, I don't want to leave you guys out of just these initial thoughts here. So if you guys want to jump in, feel free to jump in before we get to some more specific questions.
If you don't mind, one thing I stood out to me was the dynamic was not scientific. It was, you seem angry, Tour seems angry, he's being kind of mean, and on Tour's side, he was just saying, look, this science doesn't back up the claims you're making. And so Cronin didn't really address that. He just addressed more the attitude he thought was there, or the style of presenting it. So I was a little disappointed in terms of a scientific debate. Philosophically, I thought it had a lot of fascinating things which Peter Kreeft brought out. And one of those is what has already been mentioned. And I remember, maybe I'm old, because it seems like we're having the same discussion that was had when I was an undergraduate, and I read books by guys like Paul Johnson, and the Urey Miller experiment makes a number of assumptions about what the origin of life was like, and it conducts that in a laboratory where you can set up all of the outcomes that you'd like. It doesn't know if was that really what the origin of life was like. Is that really what early Earth was like? And so it seems like we're just back to those same conversations. Maybe guys like Cronin didn't know that those conversations have already happened. But what I loved was when Tour said, this actually isn't Uri Miller. It's not even Darwin. It's the Babylonian story of the origin of life.
That was
And
a brilliant line.
I was like, that was just beautiful.
Yeah.
And not only did the humans come out of the primordial ooze, so did the Babylonian gods. And he made this comment, do you want them also?
Yeah.
And so it's just fascinating to see. It's not even just going back to the 90s and Paul Johnson. It's going back to the anti-biblical worldview all the way back to Babylon. And I was really impressed that he caught that.
Boy, I kind of want to jump into something right away because, one of the, I think, the underlying issue for me as I watched the whole thing 3 times, this is just all about causality, right? This is the philosophical question of causation, and is throughout the whole thing. And, there's almost, I want to say there's almost sort of a pantheistic kind of claims being made about, matter, and we'll get into that in more detail. Yeah, I mean, I think the reference to the Babylonian gods themselves coming out of the primordial ooze, as if the primordial ooze itself has causal powers.
What you just said is, I think, right on.
Yeah.
And I've been noticing it in another area where I work in, which is analyzing Marxism. And I just had a really interesting debate with a theologian who lives in Taiwan talking about Chinese Marxism and how it is materialistic and pantheistic.
Right.
And so when Cronin says I'm a materialist, we might think about like an Epicurean who says there's just these atoms and the void. But they really believe, the Marxists and then these same guys in biology, that matter somehow moves itself.
Yeah.
And that's why when Kreft was asking about where does the cause come from, it can't be from inside. Yeah, I think that was him at the dinner table.
Right.
It can't be from the inside, it has to be from the outside. They don't agree with that. They might think that matter has some kind of life force.
Yeah, Steve, do you want to anything there that you want to comment on?
Yeah, just big picture. I mean, we can get into the details in a bit here, but there are a lot of things about the debate that I found quite interesting. One of them is, I think, sort of picking up on the conversation here already. It was, for me, a fascinating window into the mind of a gentleman like Lee Cronin, who's a committed materialist, and who's very ironic, who's intelligent, who has really a strong spirit of collaboration and an interdisciplinary sensitivity to him. He really wants to get what he sees as the collective community of science together to move forward, to produce what he regards as breakthrough technologies that will help solve some of these problems. And all of that, I think, anchored on some really deep materialist commitments. I think, as Owen's pointing out, we need to probe what those are. And that's an interesting conversation. But I guess one big picture element for me is the debate was a fascinating invitation into a very particular kind of worldview, which in one way is quite winsome and inviting, and in some other ways, I think, is troubling and problematic.
And I want to mention something. I said Paul Johnson a minute ago. I was thinking, because I've just finished rereading his Intellectuals. I meant Jonathan Wells. I don't know why I confuse those two. And Icons of Evolution. And that has a great chapter about the Uri Miller experiment and how misleading it is and the way it's presented in textbooks. And that's something else that stood out to me was just when Jim Tours gave examples of what the public thinks and the reality of what science can do. So the public thinks science has made frogs in a laboratory.
Right.
And he says, we're not even close to that.
Okay.
But they're okay with that kind of misleading because they think they're going to get there. And so it doesn't bother them.
Yeah. Okay. Let's get into Jim Tours' opening talk then. Okay.
And
Tony,
can we give just a little bit more background on what's going on here too?
Sure,
and
go ahead.
I can answer your question as well. So just a little background. After the Tour Farina debate, which was in May of 2023, A few months later, Jim Tour, I think this was in August of 2023, Jim Tour posted on his YouTube channel what he called the 60-day challenge to the 10 top origin of life researchers, where he basically asked them a series of questions about how various key biological molecules arose, and asking, can you explain how, again, polypeptides, polynucleotides, polysaccharides, how those arose under natural Earth-like conditions? How do you get the specified information in those molecules? And then how do they assemble into a living cell? And he challenged 10 leading origin of life theorists to answer those questions. Well, after 60 days, then, a couple months later, I think at the beginning of November, he then put out another YouTube video where he said, okay, 60 days went by. Nobody answered my questions. And Jim actually offered to take down all of his videos challenging the origin of life if anybody could answer any of those questions. All right. Well, nobody even tried to answer those questions, which is not unexpected. This is exactly what happened in the Tour-Farina debate. Farina didn't even attempt to answer any of Jim Tour's very reasonable questions. But what Jim did announce at the end of those 60 days is that Lee Cronin had agreed to do a roundtable about these questions and have a conversation. And as Steve Dilley just said, major kudos to Lee Cronin for doing this. I think that even though Lee Cronin ultimately also did not answer any of Jim's questions during the roundtable, the very fact that he was willing to enter into a dialogue, and it was a very civil dialogue, you could see that Lee Cronin is a reasonable guy. He's called, I believe, the Regius Chair of Chemistry in the School of Chemistry at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. So, he's a very credible, legitimate origin of life theorist. You can tell that he's a winsome, congenial, civil guy, thoughtful person. He didn't come there looking to get nasty, and I think everybody appreciated that. And you could, he's also very charismatic. I mean, you want to follow somebody like, Lee Cronin off the edge of a cliff. I don't know if that's where he's leading us or not, but he's a very charismatic guy. He's got a great haircut too, kind of like Lenny. He's somebody who is a very winsome personality, and that's to his credit. So anyway, I just want to give that background here on what was going on and what led up to this roundtable.
Unlike Farina, who actually even attacked the audience. Farina even said, all you people don't even know what the science is. Nobody seems
with
to
a
know
couple
what the science
expletives thrown in as well.
And Farina's not a degreed, he doesn't have a PhD in this field. So it was interesting. But yeah, to your point, I think it's important for us to realize it's not that nobody could put forth a model that integrates all of these fives. It's nobody can offer an answer to any of those five. And it seems to me that, there's not even a starting point is what he's saying. So.
Yeah, for myself, maybe I've been in different kinds of debates than everyone, since I'm a philosopher and I do theological debates also. I actually like when someone is just aggressive and upfront. Yeah. I don't like the winsome approach because it feels duplicitous. And it feels like they're trying to use charisma to slip something past the audience. And so what I was paying attention to was when things came up like, I'm a materialist. Okay, good. That's what I want to know. And sometimes if the winsomeness can sometimes hide that stuff. But that's why I felt like the whole thing was a kind of Motte and Bailey fallacy, which was on the front end, you don't want to do technology. Technology is great. I want to do technology. Okay, so life began through purely materialist causations. What? Wait a minute. And so I felt like that kept going on over and over. And Peter Kreeft called it out as a philosopher. He saw that was going on and said, wait, we're talking about science or technology. Those are different things. So I understand the point you're making. It's always nice to have someone who's kind in debate. I don't like being yelled at in debate, but I do like clarity. I do like when someone just says, I think you're wrong. I'm a materialist. I think only chunks of atoms exist.
Well, I tell you, and maybe this is just me. It's just a personality thing. I think you guys are really charitable, more charitable than I thought. Cronin had some only very thinly veiled insults for both Jim Tour and Peter Kreeft when he said at the panel discussion towards the end, like, just hold on, wait, and you might learn something. Yeah, or so, like to Peter Kreeft, as if Peter Kreeft is just some dude off the street who hasn't written like 100 books in philosophy, 20 of which I have upstairs, and some other things too. I thought the animus, maybe not animus is a strong word, but I thought the contempt was really just under the surface. That's the way I saw a lot of the interactions at the dinner table and the panel discussion. Yeah,
I have a
beware. But I want to now. I know Casey wants to get. I want to get back to
Go ahead.
Brian on this, on some of the more substantive scientific issues. But go ahead, Casey. Let's get you in here.
No, go
and
ahead.
you
Go
Brian.
ahead. Get Brian in there. It's
Okay.
fine. Yeah.
So Brian, I mean, I don't play clips here, but I want to just keep it going. Let's dig in now to Tour's opening talk, which included the challenge. There is sort of I'd say there's an accusation that the origin of life researchers have not been on the up and up with their results. Okay, that's clear. And I think that's a huge issue, right? That's an ethics issue. And then there's, okay, and here's why. Here are like what, he says these 4 or 5 things that need to happen if you're going to make any kind of claims like this. So take us a little bit into Tour's challenge to the OOL researchers and why they're failing to sort of make advances here.
Certainly, and I'll give you a little bit more of a preface of what is really origin of life research. Because if you look at what origin of life researchers do, all the experiments can be summarized in most of it can be summarized in 3 different buckets. One is they take gases on the early Earth. They then will maybe apply a few other materials that were available, and they apply some energy source, like an electric charge, which would mimic lightning. Then what happens, they look at the results, and they say, aha, we've got amino acids. Aha, we've got some other molecule that's useful for life. But what Jim Tour has pointed out, and what other origin of life researchers have pointed out, like Stephen Benner, is what you have is every molecule useful for life, like an amino acid, is surrounded by many other molecules. And what happens is that's really where every origin of life theory fails. That's where it ends. Now, the next challenge, which Tour brought out, is, okay, let's just assume that you've got all the molecules you want in pure form in high concentrations, like all the amino acids you want. And the challenge is when you try to link them together in chains in the right way, because they have to have the right bonds, when you look at experiments like those performed by Lee Cronin, and that's one of the experiments that Jim Tour has brought out, is what you get is essentially junk. You have these amino acids that link together, but they often link together in the wrong way. In addition, what happens is they don't contain the right sequence, the right information to do anything useful.
The carbohydrate, just think of it, six glucose molecules, molecules. How can you hook them together? A, for example. No, you can hook them together in over 1 trillion ways because there's all these different tentacles of how they can hook up. Nobody has solved the polymer stability problem when dealing with the single molecules. Time is enemy number 1, and Martin Nowak helped me calculate this on the back of a menu about a year ago. And nobody has solved the problem with this functional group side chain. This kills off all polymerizations of amino acids to make polypeptides. Nobody solved that. Nobody has solved the code problem. What's the genetic code? How do you come up with the code for life? You have to have prescribed code to orient all these molecules. Nobody knows where that comes from.
And another problem that Tour has pointed out and others have pointed out, if you were to, let's say, take the output of these experiments and you were to drop them in an ocean in the ancient Earth, or you put them in a little pool, what would happen is those molecules would simply break apart. So that's the challenge that Tour was presenting. And what he said is when you look at Lee Cronin's research, his earlier research attempted to look at the chemistry, but it all failed. He didn't produce anything useful. So now what's happened is Lee Cronin is looking at these more abstract mathematical models like assembly theory. And that's kind of the third bucket of research. And when you look at that research, what happens is it's completely detached from the real world. It doesn't in any way model the real chemistry. So that's the point that Tour made, is that he made a prediction. He said, I predict when Lee Cronin gives you his talk, he will give you no solutions to the problems I've mentioned. He'll tell you nothing about how the chemistry could have moved a molecular system towards life. And he'll give you no knowledge of how life could have originated. And that's exactly what happened in the debate.
If I could add something else, there was also sort of a science communication criticism that Jim Tour levied. Brian did a great job explaining the science that the scientific challenges that Jim Tour posed. And this was alluded to earlier, I believe, that Jim Tour is really concerned that origin of life theorists are overstating what has been accomplished to the public. And so, for example, I think Owen mentioned that he talked about the fact that a very large percentage of the public believes that people have made frogs in the lab or have made life in the lab. And these are based upon surveys of people's beliefs about the origin of life. And so why does the public have these totally mistaken beliefs? Of course, that has never happened. Nobody has produced life in the lab. Nobody has shown how you can produce life under simulated natural early Earth conditions. And so why do people believe this? Well, Jim Tour gives quotes in many of his videos, and he did this a little bit at the roundtable, including one from Lee Cronin, of people saying that they have produced life in the lab. Or he has a quote from Lee Cronin back in 2011 saying that he's going to produce life in the lab within 2 years. Okay. So there's a reason why the public believes this. And it's because leading origin of life theorists are going around saying that people have produced life in the lab. And then you also look at the textbooks. The textbooks make these claims. In fact, sometimes Jim will show a large stack of textbooks that are promoting the sort of false view that say the primordial soup theory helped to solve the origin of life. Do you know where those textbooks come from? This is my wall of biology textbooks, you guys. And a while back, Jim contacted me and asked me to come up with a list of textbooks and take a picture of them for him, of textbooks that are basically making false claims about the primordial soup model and this idea that life emerged from this soupy mixture on the early Earth. And of course, this is now widely even disregarded by the origin of life community. But so I had a staff member and we went through a bunch of textbooks. We sent Jim a nice photo of a big stack of them. And these are literally the textbooks from my wall of biology textbooks here in my office. And so it's no wonder that the public has these false beliefs when they're being told by leading theorists and in the textbooks they're reading that the origin of life question has essentially been resolved. And so Jim's point really is that the origin of life theorist needs to tone down its rhetoric. The field as a whole needs to be very honest and open about the fact that they have not resolved these questions. To Lee Cronin's credit, although I do agree with many of the accusations that he was kind of shifty sometimes and trying to get you to believe the origin of life solution is within our grasp without actually providing anything remotely close to a solution. It was all about believe, just have faith, follow my charisma to the ends of the earth. But, I think that nonetheless, at least he acknowledged during the roundtable that we don't have a solution. And I think that is a true statement. And so one of Jim's best arguments he made during his opening statement, which by the way was 100% focused on the science. He didn't shout. He didn't get angry. He kept his cool and his calm. It was a great opening statement that Jim made during this roundtable. But Jim made this point that each advance that is made in the origin of life chemistry field, it may solve one small little problem. But meanwhile, our knowledge of the complexity of the cell keeps increasing at a much greater pace, meaning that the prospect of a solution to the origin of life is continually receding, as Jim puts it. So the problem keeps getting worse. As Tour said, he said, we learn a little bit about chemistry, we learn a lot about the cell, and the prospect of solving how the cell or the origin of life might have evolved and originated naturally just keeps getting further and further away from us the more that we discover. And I thought that was a very good framing that Jim put on the question.
And what you just said, Casey, is exactly why the book Icons of Evolution came to mind, which is the biology textbooks continue to use misleading information that favors a materialist philosophical outlook. And that's where I felt it was more like a apologist for materialism, Cronin was, than just a scientist. And so when he's going after Tour and saying, why are you being mean? It's like, I'm not sure it is mean. I didn't read him as being mean at all. Just saying you don't have any proof. Which is what a scientist should want. And then kind of just saying, well, we should be optimistic. We want to be friendly to future studies. We don't want to shut down future studies. Well, but we want to know what the studies are and if they should be funded. I thought that was why funding was important. And it was kind of funny to me, the amounts of money being thrown around, because I know at somewhere like Harvard, 50 million is nothing. But to the rest of us, 50 million. Well, maybe, I don't know about you in California, 50 million in the budget's nothing. In Arizona, that's still a lot of money.
Well, that line of
and so
rhetoric,
when someone says, well, what would you do with 50 million? As if you got to do something with it versus, well, it was given by donors or taxpayers under false pretenses. They were told you're just about to make life. And if you just give another 50 million, you'll push us over the goalpost. And it's not true. And so the money may not be there to spend in the first place.
let me just as a point of reference here in Jim Tour's opening talk, he referenced Jack Szostak, who made a 2014 claim about how he was going to be able to create life in the lab. And then Cronin made a claim in 2011 about making life in the lab. So, I mean, okay, there's a lot here because to add on to Owen's last point, I thought a lot of Cronin's rhetoric about what science is and how we do science and problems is having problems is how we advance, and having disagreements is how we advance. I thought that was a lot of just hand waving, to be honest, to get away from this more serious ethical charge, I think, or ethical accusation that Tour's making, that the public has been deceived in a sense.
That's a big deal.
And I don't know. My father was an academic engineer for 40 years at the University of Notre Dame. I talked to him on occasion. He was department chair, and he talks about what people will do to get funding. I mean, I don't want to, just say that I don't want to make any strong claim there, but I mean, I think we got to take into account that, people are people, egos are at work here.
Well, we all talk about transparency with the government.
Yeah.
And I think we're hopefully transitioning to a time where we're going to require transparency with universities also. Yeah. And how they spend their money and the claims they make and what we actually get.
I think there's also a presupposition of combinatorialism, that the idea is if I can solve this one little piece, then I can just add it to the puzzle. And all we have to do is put all the chains together, which again, Tour said, no, that doesn't work that way because you have the n+1 problem. Well, okay, they come together, but what if they break apart and things like that? So, but there seems to be an assumption, and throughout Cronin's reply to Tour, I got the feeling that he was saying, well, I solve this part and you solve that part, and eventually we'll string them all together. But if you have the wrong presupposition, then it's never going to work.
We're making progress. Someone needs to count up how many times did Lee Cronin say, we're making progress, we're making progress. Okay, that's great. But can you answer any of Jim Tour's questions? That's what I really want to know.
Okay, well, let's go back to Brian. So one of the things that, and Brian, you already touched on this. One of the things that Cronin responded was assembly theory.
What does assembly theory actually do? So assembly theory tries to explain how selection is the driving force that produces proto-evolution outside of biology. Selection is the force that produces the star. If you take an object, cut it up with a pair of scissors in your head, you can cut it up to basically minimize the reuse on a graph. Abracadabra, just imagine that, put it on a graph. You then count how many copies of the object you have, and the larger the number of copies and the larger the assembly index, the more you're sure it came from evolution. That's the basic premise.
Assembly theory tells us how to detect selection and so on and so forth. And just as another point of reference, Jim Tour has already followed up in a video with Hector Zanil, who I think is an expert in this field, about assembly theory. So Brian and Casey, maybe, and Steve, I don't know if you want to chime in. Assembly theory was Cronin's big thing. This was what he was throwing out there as his response to Tour's challenges. So give us some sense of what assembly theory is and how he's trying to use that.
Sure. And what'll be helpful is to give you a little bit of a background, because what's interesting about this conversation is that Tour is being much more generous about the field than many leaders in the field. Like, there's an amazing paper by Stephen Benner. It's called Paradoxes in the Origin of Life. And in this paper, and again, Stephen Benner is considered one of the leading researchers in the world. It's one of the people that Tour mentioned. And he's absolutely committed to believing it was through a purely natural process. So he's as biased as anyone that it had to be natural. Yet, he stated that all that we know about chemistry and physics and every origin of life research, all the research that's been done, point to the fact that the origin of life appears impossible. That's really striking, because the problem is that natural processes will tend to break things down into lower energy and greater disorder. But origin of life requires nature to build things up into systems of high order and high energy. So Steve Benner recognizes that the origin of life appears impossible based on the science. But at the end of the paper, what he says is we have to assume it happened. Essentially, don't give up the faith. We'll figure something out. that's really striking. Another paper that's similar is by Michael Russell, who's another leader of the field. His paper is called Frankenstein or a Submarine Alkaline Vent Who is Responsible for Abiogenesis, and it was in Bioessays. And he says in his paper that everything that happens in life happens because a machine makes it happen. Every reaction, every process only happens because complex machinery in the cell forces it to happen. And he says that the possibility of simple chemistry and energy inputs on the early Earth producing anything useful to life appears impossible. So that's really striking. And what's interesting is if you look at Sarah Walker, and Sarah Walker is one of the people that was on the assembly paper. She's one of the authors.
Right.
She did a beautiful paper with Paul Davies. So I actually have a lot of respect for Paul Davies and Sarah Walker. They're very insightful.
ASU.
Yes.
Little plug.
Oh, there you go. And they said in The Hard Problem of Life that you have to worry about information. Information is key because physics and chemistry can't simply explain life. You need information. And they talk about how to explain this, it can't be explained by the normal laws of physics. They say to explain the causal power of information, causal purchase, they say, we have to imagine completely different physics. That's striking. So when Sarah Walker joined Lee Cronin, it's really interesting because Lee Cronin before did this chemistry experiments trying to figure out how molecules could form into molecular machines or polypeptides. But now assembly theory has nothing to do with chemistry. And what's interesting is the logic of assembly theory is pretty much the same as Bill Dembski's design detection filter, the design inference. His paper, Lee Cronin's paper, is essentially a method for detecting design. And to detect design, you have to describe two things. One, you have to look at the probability of something occurring. Like, what's the probability that a bunch of letters in your alphabet soup will come together in a certain sequence? But also, you have to think about how are certain patterns special? How are they specified? And when you have both something improbable and something that is some way specified or special, it points to design. So what's interesting in Lee Cronin's paper is he's using the exact same logic, but instead of saying design, he's saying natural selection.
Yes.
So he appeals to natural selection, not as a real process, because as Stephen Benner said in his paper that I mentioned, Paradoxes in the Origin of Life, it appears theoretically impossible for nucleotides or amino acids to come together and have the right information because you just need too many trials and you couldn't possibly have that many trials on the early Earth. That's very striking. But Lee Cronin isn't talking about natural selection as a real process, but more it's like a secular demigod. So what's interesting about assembly theory is you look at the mathematics, and part of his assembly index is simply the inverse of the probability of some complex systems coming together in the simplest way possible. And part of it is its specialness. And the specialness is simply the number of copies you see. Because the logic is you see more copies of the same thing, it's more special. And he would say it's because natural selection acted more. So that's what's so striking about his paper, is it really reflects Sarah Walker, who knows that information is essential. She knows there's something special with life. But what happens, instead of using design language, they simply use the language of natural selection.
Steve, Owen, do you guys want to jump in on that? A lot to say about how he was using the word selection.
Yeah, I do want to pick up that point in a moment, but also just reflect for a moment in light of what Brian's saying on what I would say is the rhetorical challenge for somebody like Jim Tour in this context. And in light of his dialogue with Lee, and for that matter, Lee Cronin's rhetorical challenge too, I think part of the challenge is one of the things that both Cronin and Tour are looking at is specified complexity, the sequence of amino acids, nucleotide bases, and so on. So one of the points of data is what Brian, Casey, I, and others in the intelligent design movement would regard as compelling evidence of design. Right. But what's difficult for Jim Tour in particular is he says explicitly that he thinks it's probably the case that there will be a natural origin to life, or he doesn't mean that naturalistically in the sense that God was not involved. He means what we call like a secondary process.
Secondary
not God's
causation.
primary activity, but him perhaps setting up the universe and orchestrating the advent of the first life on Earth in a way that doesn't require direct miraculous intervention. Okay, so I think part of the challenge is Tour is saying, look, there are these unsolved problems, but he thinks some natural process or set of processes will eventually come to light that is the correct path in which life unfolded. And I think the challenge is if you say that on the one hand, and then part of the data you're looking at on the other hand is this sequence of highly specific, highly complex strings of genetic information, say in every cell, or what was necessary in the first cell, then you have the difficulty of the one hand of what's seeming to be good evidence of, we might say, direct design, and on the other hand, still a commitment that some as of yet undiscovered natural processes will account for that. So that's a difficulty, I think, for the overall picture that Jim has in mind. And if that's presented to somebody like Cronin, I can understand him saying, in so many words, look, we both agree that natural processes will be uncovered. And as soon as you make that move, I think you don't have to attend quite so much to things like sequence specificity, that assembly theory really is a mode of design detection. And in effect, although I think Jim was correct to point out many of the problems, I think his deeper, or part of his commitment or hope or belief that we'll have a natural account ends up, I think, conceding significant ground to Cronin just saying, oh, well, I do too. And I just think we're at an earlier stage, and maybe Cronin should have been more explicit with the public and so on about where we're at. But in a sense, you have deep agreement on a deep issue that I think that mitigates or shades the clear evidence of design that is right there. And that I think that shifts the whole contour of the debate in a significant way that doesn't help, frankly, a kind of robust case for what Jim is ultimately after.
Well,
Yeah,
I think it's interesting to really listen very, very carefully to what Jim said. And I've been listening to this very carefully and have been on his podcast and so forth. And because Jim has said, okay, I will play by your rules. I'll just kind of look at natural processes. I'm not going to think about anything outside of that box. He's agreed to play in their playing field, so to speak. But when you hear him speak, he talked about he's sympathetic towards people looking for design arguments. He's sympathetic to people looking for ways to measure design. But he says, I don't have a way in my lab to measure design. I can't take a spectroscope or I can't take a chemical protocol and detect design. So yes, he's absolutely right. I totally agree with him that he can't detect design because that's not what he does. He's an organic chemist. But he says he's sympathetic to people looking at those measures. And I think it's really striking that Bill Dembski just came out with his new book, the second edition of Design Inference, which gives exactly what Tour is talking about. But Tour recognizes that he's not an expert in mathematics or philosophy, so that's not his thing. He's operating in the playing field that he's trained to operate in and obeying the rules that they've told him he has to obey to be part of the conversation. So I think that's a good thing to think about in the background.
Now, that's a great point, because when he mentioned that, I think it was towards the end of the panel discussion that he didn't have a tool to detect design. I immediately thought of, well, I have the signed copy upstairs, I think, thanks to Casey for that, of the second edition of the Design Inference. Yeah.
Where you get into kind of methodological naturalism.
You're right.
So
right.
I think that's where Peter Kreck was the
that.
only one who had the tools.
Right.
To speak into this. And I mean, also he's just kind of a senior scholar, even if you disagree with him on a lot of things. He's a notable scholar who's been in the academy a long time. Yeah. So I thought Cronin should have had some deference to him for that reason, that okay, he's trying to make
and not just Cronin, but some of the others at the table as well. I mean, that Melissa Franklin Boy,
Because
I
I
wouldn't
think-
want to be at a
I think
dinner with her necessarily.
The point about science and technology is really important here.
Yeah.
And a lot of the philosophical materialists' claims piggyback on supposed advances in technology. And those, you'll always see this again as a modern Bailey fallacy where they'll say, don't you like cell phones? Therefore, we created life in a petri dish. I don't want to lose my cell phone, so I guess I better believe that. And so, or cancer research was maybe one brought up, right? You don't like cancer? No, I hate cancer. Well, you got to believe life started in petri dishes then. And so you'll always have this going on. I thought that he called that out real well and added an additional problem for the materialist, which is, okay, even you like technological advances, why? Toward what goal do they aim?
Yeah,
That's a very Aristotelian question.
Yeah.
And the naturalist, the contemporary naturalist, has gotten rid of everything except for efficient causation.
This
So they
is
don't
a
have
larger,
final causation. They can't answer that.
yeah,
Yeah.
this is a larger problem, I think, in society where, and we talk about scientism a lot, but even Hawking and Mlodinow in their book, I mean, in his first page, he says how philosophy is dead and the physicist is now reigning and he'll answer the questions of tomorrow. And there does seem to be a hubris in folks who have steeped themselves so much in the science that they think that the advances that you talk about, and they're important advances. I mean, everybody recognizes
But with every
that-
advance like that, the utopian technological story has a realistic dystopian 20th century.
That's right.
So
They
for
can be
every time
used-
you say, well, don't you like this? Yeah, but we also lived through the 20th century.
which is, I mean, that was even Mary Shelley's point in writing the modern Prometheus, right? It's the idea is, again, what are you advancing? And if you're advancing human betterment, then we still have to bring in the virtues and we still have to look
Yeah,
to
tell us, yep.
philosophy. We can't just dismiss it.
Let's stick on the philosophical issue here, because one thing that frustrated me, and Brian and Steve already sort of touched on this, was the way that Cronin was using the word selection as, I think, Brian, you said, a sort of a secular demigod.
Well, it's capitalized by Darwin, right?
Yeah, S with the capital S, that
As if it's
has
a person
generative
that does things.
powers. It does things, it does all kinds of things. But then later in the talk, he almost scolds Peter Kraft where he says, well, look, it's not magic that we're talking about. And I'm like, it kind of is. It's your own version of magic, if you want to.
You have that Thor meme, isn't it though?
Yeah. So, Steve, you mentioned in your email that you want to talk a little bit about the idea of mind here, because it just really seemed to me that Cronin, and not just Cronin, but the others at the table. I mean, this is she a physicist? I believe her name was Melissa Franklin. She was on the panel, and she made some really offhanded remarks about the Little Prince and this idea that these theists just believe in magic. I mean, there was again, it was thinly veiled.
She also introduced me to something I didn't know about. She interrupted at one point and said, it's okay if I interrupt because I have ADHD. And I normally have a card that I hand out that explains this. And I was thinking to myself, this is great. I didn't know I could do that.
Yeah, that was strange. And I tell you, her last comment to Tour, that was, I mean, it wasn't even a veiled insult where the camera was on Tour and he just looked over at the moderator. Like, I don't even know where she kind of said to him, because we know how interested you are in people not lying about things or not telling the truth about things. And so she was fairly aggressive there, but there was this making fun. I felt, at least my impression was this sort of like Lenny said, we're the physicists at the table, we're the scientists, and you sort of philosophers, at least with regards to Kraft, let us tell you sort of how the world works. And Kraft did. He brought up a point about external, intrinsic causation versus there's some other external force, even said supernatural force, acting on material objects.
So I predict that Lee Cronin, a synthetic chemist, will not discuss anything tonight about chemical reactions leading to life's origin. I predict Lee Cronin will remain silent on polypeptides, polynucleotides, polysaccharides, these three key polymers that build us, and cell assembly, resorting to calling those narrow questions and not worth even addressing.
Since we know that cells came after molecules, some other force than the molecules themselves must have moved them. Now, that force must be external to molecules, and it must be either outside of molecules in the environment or it must be some force outside the universe, right?
We don't know that. Everything on Earth is pretty much touched by biology in some way. We don't know that every planet in the sky around life doesn't emerge eventually. I'm really, Jim, I don't really know what your agenda is. I don't know who your audience is. I came here tonight hoping you weren't gonna get up there and shout and misquote. And I refuse to get in that conversation. I came here in good faith. I'm only going to take part in the panel interview if we actually really put away our let's just make statements for claims and actually ask, well, what is interesting? What do you find confusing? Where are the new problems?
And, but so it was frustrating, it was frustrating to me that Cronin was using what I would call agentive language for these material, for selection, as if it was an agent. But then he wanted to scold the Kreeft and others for as if they're talking about magic.
Yeah, and that point makes me think about the Greek word nous, and the Greek scientists or philosophers, materialists, all debated this exact idea. Where does mind exist? Is it in physical objects? Does it motivate them to do things? Is it external to them? So for me, watching this debate, it was, again, and that's why I thought it was so brilliant that Tour brought up Babylonian mythology. Yeah. This stuff's been discussed before, and Cronin may not know that. That's on him. He should know this stuff, and that is why the humanities are important. None of this is new, and none of it's due to recent technology. And even the last 200 years, the Greeks debated this idea. Ultimately, he found it even in the Babylonian origin stories. And it reminds me of that documentary Expelled, where Richard Dawkins tells us, God, that's ridiculous. Okay, well, where do you think life came from? Aliens. And it's literally before the alien guy meme. I'm not saying it was aliens, but it was aliens. Richard Dawkins thinks that. That's his solution. And that's, again, the Babylonian solution. Some powerful beings from up there came to Earth and started life here. And so there's nothing new that I'd like to see that engaged with by these scientists. And maybe they can't because they don't have that humanities background. They don't know how to do that.
Well, one thing that's been interesting when I've talked to really high-level scientists is often they really hate talking about philosophy. It's not just that it's something that they don't understand, they don't necessarily think it's valuable, but they feel threatened by it, almost angry. Because what philosophy does is it questions their underlying assumptions about reality. And they have this view of reality that everything is just natural processes. And they hate having that faith commitment challenged because they know if they step out of that framework, the world may look very different from what they expect. And that could be very scary.
Well, what you and Casey have both used that imagery of just believism or faith. And I think that's exactly right. It felt like one of these Hallmark Christmas story movies, just believe and it'll come true. And at the same time, though, they'll make fun of Christian students in their classes for having faith in God. And so it's just sort of like, well, what are you doing different? And it does remind me of the three groups of people Socrates questioned. And these kind of scientists I put in the third group, the tradesmen, meaning they're technicians. They know how to build things, which are very impressive, Socrates said. But at the end of the day, they can't answer Peter Kreft's question, which is really Socrates' question. Why? Why do you do it? What purpose does it serve? Well, it makes my life more comfortable. Yeah, but then you still die. I mean, well, I'll live forever. I think I read one of my favorite ideas for immortality was Elon Musk saying we're going to download our consciousness into a chip and put it on, store it on a moon of Jupiter. That sounds great. Like, I can't wait to live forever in a computer chip on a moon of Jupiter. Like, why? For what purpose? And they can't answer that question. And that's what Socrates found too. And of those three groups, he commended them the most because they do make useful things, but they don't know what purpose it serves.
Steve, you've been trying to let's you get you in here.
Yeah, I do think the question of purposiveness, as Owen's saying, and Brian's earlier point about these deeper philosophical commitments. I think it's quite interesting that somebody like Cronin, who is a committed materialist, when he's describing his theory, or when he's describing the elements of how the theory would help advance origin of life research, as you're pointing out, Tony, he does use this agent-oriented language, the term selection, he uses the term memory. And I think there's a long trend of this. You certainly see this in the Origin of Species, where there's purposive, not just purposive, but agent-like a language that's used of what purport to be natural processes. So Darwin, when he's writing about natural selection, he says it's famously, it's daily and hourly scrutinizing, adding up all that is good. You know, there's the language of agency that's being attributed to nature, and then at the same time, the audience is asked to discard that language as being purely metaphorical or purely figurative, when the agent language itself is used both for the intelligibility, so we understand what assembly theory means or what natural selection is, and it's also used for plausibility, because we know from our first person experience, we know what it's like for agents to do things. We know from our first person experience that agents create complex things, bicycles, radios. My kids are into Lego and so on. So the agent-based language takes what we see of ordinary nature, which in our experience doesn't in and of itself, in our sort of first person experience, create a lot of complexity. When leaves fall off the trees in my yard, I don't get messages typically. So we attribute what Cronin does.
Typically, I like you qualify that.
Yeah.
Sometimes I do, but it's not normal.
Yeah. There's the attribution of something that is based in our own experience, produces complexity, but then the quick qualification of no, that's figurative. And in my way of thinking, the use of agent language, which we're asked to take seriously, and then we're also asked not to take seriously at the same time, is a little bit like climbing up a ladder and then claiming that the lower rungs are dispensable. Climbing up the materialist account using language, the only way we'd find that plausible is if we had reference to mind and what minds do and what agents choose, and then saying, oh, these lower rungs that got us here actually were just purely figurative. They actually didn't, they're not to be taken too seriously. I think rhetorically and frankly epistemologically for somebody like Cronin, that's a very difficult position to be in if you're really going to defend it.
Well, and he said, right, I'm just my brain at one point. We can map our brains. It's just a matter of we don't maybe have the computers that can do it yet, but we'll eventually just be able to map them. And there you are. Now you could duplicate yourself with a software or a downloaded chip of some kind. So I think your point there, Stephen, plus the original one you made about the distinction between primary and secondary causes is the big point. It's really well taken, which is there's no place for God in their understanding. And so they're okay pushing it back further and further and further, and including aliens from other planets, because the idea that God made life doesn't fit into their assumptions. Kind of what Brian just said too. They'd have to rethink their faith commitment to materialism. And so as long as technology is humming along and producing these benefits, they don't really see a need to. But I do think, I mean, they'd be right if they pointed out, kind of also to Brian's point, that philosophy is not exact. I mean, we're not producing cell phones for anybody. What have we done lately? But making someone uncomfortable about their presuppositions is kind of like, if we're still doing that, then we are doing what we're supposed to do, which is raise questions and get us to rethink, hey, maybe we don't have the right assumptions. So I think there could be some fear about philosophy for that reason. The scientists would say, look, we've actually helped people. What have the philosophers done?
Well,
I
mean, one of the things that was clear, and we've Brian, you, Steve, you Owen, you guys have all just pointed it out, is in the academic world, there's still this just massive disconnect, right, between the natural sciences and philosophy. I mean, it just has carried over from, I don't know, the 19th century, positivism, whatever.
Well, it's built into the modern research university, I think, because you're supposed to produce things that help society. And that, I think that is one reason. Another part of me is involved in debates about cultural Marxism. And I think that's another reason why that's popular for the humanists, is because they say that's how we can help make society better. We can make a more equitable society because we need to live up to that standard. And classical liberalism doesn't do anything. And so we need to abandon that. So I think that's partly built into the research university model. And just the fact that, on that progress standard, philosophy doesn't really make things, right? It doesn't invent things.
Well,
so
That's going to
technique.
change though, because our technology is running farther from farther than our ethics can
Well, you
catch
will
up.
see in almost every philosophy
So-
department a poster that says famous philosophers, Steve Jobs, right? And
Yeah.
it'll list like all these guys. And I always feel it's a little bit, I guess I feel pathetic, like guys, that makes us look bad actually, because
Yeah,
there's just like
no, but I'm thinking
some other guys'
more of,
success.
You know that.
I'm thinking more of the engineering department that comes up with the Google's driving car and they put it on the road in Arizona. And now you've got Philippa Foot's trolley problem in actuality.
Yeah, in real
When
life,
none
right.
of the engineers have ever studied Foot or philosophy and don't know even the questions that they have to deal with. I mean,
But I think it gets something that Steve had mentioned. What we should talk about is God of the gaps, and I think that is
Yeah.
what comes up. Which
Well, and
is,
that's
do
going
we
to
really need God? Can we just fill it in eventually, so we don't even need God anymore?
Whatever you want to say. But we move those experiments further. You know, I don't know what's going on here, but I read a lot of David Deutsch, who I think is really at the right interface here. A lot about what Galileo did, and I'm no Galileo, but I do think that there are segments in society that want to cause the God of the gaps. And I'm sorry, Jim, I actually think you're just there's a God in the gaps. I've looked at it very clearly. You say on one hand, I accept it's going to be solved. And on the other hand, you so vociferously make arguments about, hey, I hate the way science works. When you do that yourself in your own science, be it nanotransistors, new conductors, new catalysts. So you kind of move the goalposts. And I disagree that the problem is getting bigger and the goalposts are moving in the past. That's not what's happening. Jim is very, very nicely playing a sleight of hand here by saying and this and this and this, missing the key shift that has to happen in the discipline.
Right. So Brian wanted to make a point, and then I saw Casey also trying to pipe. So Brian, you wanted to get a word in edgewise as well.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Well,
thought so.
I'll speak.
Okay.
I'll speak anyway, and of what I would have said later is it's interesting with God of the gaps, because the logic of it, goes back to Epicurus, Lucretius, this idea that we know the world is just natural processes, just matter in motion, these rules of interactions, chance and time. That's it. So if you say something looks like it's designed in nature, then it's God of the gaps, because it's simply, we don't yet know how a natural process did it. But in reality, when you look at the way the science is progressing, it's really the opposite. You look at evidence of design everywhere in the laws of nature, in our planet, in life. And what happens is every attempt to rationalize away the evidence of design through some natural process, like a multiverse, or the RNA world hypothesis, or some narrative about how the eye came about, collapses as science advances. So it really is a materialism of the gaps. The truth is the opposite. We see design everywhere, and every attempt to rationalize it away fades as time goes on. And what I mentioned before, what a lot of origin of life people do is they talk about natural selection as a demigod with creative agency. And that's how they rationalize away the evidence of design. But a second demigod is self-organization.
Yeah.
So what you always hear in origin of life research is either natural selection, self-organization, emergence, or both. And usually it's both. And that's always where you have essentially a design of the gaps. Where you see evidence of design, we don't want to recognize it, will appeal to self-organization without any intellectual content or natural selection to explain it away.
That's great.
And I think one of the other professors at the Harvard professors at the dinner table conversation mentioned self-organization. I can't remember, it was one of the older gentlemen on the end.
Well, it connects
Maybe it
up
was
with
a-
the point
yeah.
about Babylon, because the Babylonian thing is you had chaos and then order emerged from what? It just does.
Yeah.
And so that's exactly the point is there's no naturalistic explanation of that, though. It doesn't seem like order emerges out of chaos in any of our experiences.
Well, and Stephen, I mean, we know that, we're getting spookier and spookier metaphysical theories about matter, right? In the last 30 or 40 years, whether, you talk about like panpsychist theories
It's popular now.
of subatomic particles having some level or degree or kind of conscious life. So, that I'm starting to move away from the idea of, material versus immaterial language and personal versus impersonal. I think is maybe even a more appropriate way to discuss, the issue of whether or not we think things are, caused by agents or caused by impersonal forces. But Casey,
Yeah.
Steve, why don't you go ahead and then let Casey jump in after that?
Yeah, I think there's a interesting dilemma, because on the one hand, as we've mentioned, Cronin was using agent-like language to describe his theory. There's selection. At some point, I want to return to that because I think it's fascinating to think about what that might mean. But in any case, he uses terms like selection and memory, which, as we've noted, are mind-based or mind-oriented types of descriptors. And then, on the other hand, as Owen's pointing out, he has a strong materialist view of the mind. And if we take that seriously, then even his own first-person experience, or the first-person experience of others, is ultimately reduced to efficient causes of matter and motion. So the very language that's used to make his theory intelligible and plausible, agent-based language, it turns out in his own worldview, that would dissolve into purposeless, mindless, physical chemical interactions. So when he would lose not only his own mind in the material view, but would lose the very grounds to explain and render plausible his assembly theory when taken on its own terms, when taken on his own worldview in a significant way. So there you have a worldview that I think effectively undermines the evidence that he's citing for a key component of it, assembly theory, the origin of life, and so on. To connect this to your earlier point, whether we describe Cronin as a kind of classical materialist, or whether there's some panpsychism or whatever, it does look like his understanding of what minds are and what nature is articulated in a way that significantly undercuts itself.
Yeah, Casey, did you have anything?
Yeah, I'd like to drill down on this conversation we're having about selection, God of the gaps, and what was mentioned earlier about Jim Tour not supporting intelligent design, which he says he doesn't, and I'll take him at face value with that. But I just want to kind of tie these things together for us. Selection is often used as everybody has been saying, as a magic wand or a demigod or a divine substitute that can do anything you want just when you need it. You need something, then selection can provide it. All right, fine. The problem, this actually applies directly to this conversation we're having about the origin of life. Because the problem is that you can't get selection until you have replication. So in order to get selection, you really need a self-replicating molecule. And nobody ever seemed to address this in the Tour-Cronin conversation. And in fact, many of origin of life theorists therefore place the origin of life as the origin of this first self-replicating molecule. Because they will say, once we get this self-replicating molecule, then we can have selection, we can have Darwinian evolution, and then, basically selection can magically take us and produce all the rest of the complexity of life from there. All we need to get is this first self-replicating molecule, and that is the origin of life. The problem for origin of life theorists is that the origin of replication is actually an incredibly complex and difficult problem to solve. And most folks today want to propose that the RNA world hypothesis is the best explanation for where this first self-replicating molecule came from, a very special RNA molecule that can carry information, can also carry out certain key metabolic tasks, and also make copies of itself. That was the moment where life originated. Well, to produce this first special self-replicating molecule, again, that's really tantamount to the origin of information. Okay, how do you get the information in this first self-replicating molecule to allow it to self-replicate? And Jim Tour actually alludes to this in one of the questions he asked, where he says, where does the specified complexity come from in life? Okay, so we have to account for the origin of the specified complexity to be able to explain how we get the first self-replicating molecule. And until we do that, we can't even enter into how there's selection and what selection is doing for us. And so all of Lee Cronin's talk about selection doing this or selection doing that is really irrelevant. If he cannot account for the first self-replicating molecule, he's not allowed to invoke selection. And all the questions that Jim Tour is asking about where do the polysaccharides come from, where do the polynucleotides come from, where do the polypeptides come from, those are all relevant to getting the first self-replicating system. And if you can't account for that, then Lee Cronin really is not allowed to invoke selection. So how do you get the first self-replicating molecule? Well, the only mechanism that we have really is we have to be able to produce a long RNA molecule that somehow has the right nucleotides in the right order in order to allow it to self-replicate. And the only cause, it's not even a cause, but the only explanation that you can have for that is chance. Chance has to produce a long RNA molecule. And maybe, obviously there's chemical reactions producing all these RNAs, but they want to envision this environment where all these RNAs are randomly being generated with randomly generated sequences of nucleotides, and you get one RNA that just happens to have the right order of nucleotides that allows it to self-replicate. So but you can't appeal to selection. Okay, Cronin can't appeal to selection to explain how the nucleotides get in the right order to allow this self-replicating molecule to arise. And that is really a key point. So again, the origin of life really comes down to the origin of specified complexity and getting the nucleotides in the right order in this first self-replicating RNA. And Tour might not be pro-ID, but he references specified complexity. He's using an ID term that we developed because complex and specified information is the kind of information that is generated when an intelligent agent acts. So I'm speaking to you right now. You're hearing sound vibrations. These are complex because they're very unlikely, and they're specified because they match a pattern that is known to conform to words of the English language. And you immediately recognize these sounds as design because specified complexity is a hallmark of how we recognize design. So even though Jim Tour does not support design, he recognizes that life has a special property in the form of specified complexity, and we need to account for that. So this, finally, I'll finish this up here. This gets to the God of the gaps. The claim that invoking design is somehow, plugging God or plugging a designer into something that we don't understand. The problem with that accusation is that we're doing the exact opposite. We know from experience that when intelligent agents operate, they produce high levels of specified and complex information. And so when we are invoking design to account for the origin of specified complexity, we're actually invoking a cause which we know from experience explains the origin of specified complexity. We're not basing our argument upon something we don't know. It's not a gaps-based argument. We're basing it upon something we do know. We do know that intelligent agents are the sole known cause to generate high levels of complex and specified information, which happens to be the exact type of information you need to explain how the first self-replicating molecule arose in the origin of life. So origin of life really needs intelligent design to explain where the information came from and to get Lee Cronin the selection that he so, preciously covets.
Well, and let me just, now go to Steve, but Casey, this is exactly what the sense I had was that he was pushing selection with a big S far back before biology, before chemistry, even into physics. And this is where I start thinking, we had Melissa Cain Travis on not too long ago. And she was talking about Max Tegmark, I think, who's got sort of this Platonic, heavy Platonic view of almost like where it's the math where that does the causation.
Let's say Hawkins.
Yeah, it's like Hawkins, So it did seem to me like he was using selection in a prebiotic, pre-chemistry sense, that selection is this physical force. I mean, I have a quote here. He says at around 111:55, which is in his opening talk, selection is the force that produces our stars. And I'm like, this is like math, I guess, producing things and generating things. So I think he did do that. That was his move, was to make selection, like, to use Brian's words. I think Brian's word, a demigod, is a good term for it. Steve, you had your hand up.
Yeah, just two quick footnotes about selection. One, supportive of Casey's point. Some origin of life researchers have termed prebiotic natural selection as a contradiction in terms. In a prebiotic context, there can't be the type of selection that is meant with the phrase, with the concept, natural selection. So I think you're right. apparently Cronin is using it in a different way and kind of stepping back and thinking, well, how is the term selection being used? I think he runs into something of a dilemma, sort of a universal / nominal kind of problem. On the one hand, if selection, as he's using it, if it's to be an identifiable and unified, a mind-independent cause, if it actually makes a causal difference, and it's an identifiable cause that's recognizable from instance to instance of selection, whether it's the formation of stars, as you're saying, Tony, or it's the reason why polar bears with longer fur survive, or eagles with very sharp vision, why they survive. If selection, if there's something that, if it's an actual cause and if it's in a unified thing or unified process, then all of those different types of organisms or instances, there has to be some kind of unified cause, selection, that unites all of them. But it's very difficult to see what that could be when it comes to things like formation of elements necessary for stars, when it comes to thinking of the formation of the eye of an eagle. If we just say something like, well, we mean adaptation to environment, probably what we've given there is just a description in a sense, but even that wouldn't apply to the formation of stars, I don't think. But at most, we've given a kind of straightforward description, but not an actual identifiable and unified cause or causal process. So if we don't have that, then selection seems to function kind of like latitude and longitude do. Just a helpful way, a helpful point of reference, a helpful fiction, a useful fiction for us to organize our own thoughts. But in that case, selection wouldn't actually be something in the world that actually is a cause that unifies all these many very, very disparate things that are supposed to be subject to selection. So there's a problem here in terms of what it is we're talking about. You need a unified account on the one hand, or you have a useful fiction on the other hand. There is no unified account, particularly in with everything from the cosmos to biology that Cronin's talking about. And if it's just a useful fiction, then that means it is explanatorily empty. And of course, that is unattractive from his point of view as well.
That's a great point. One thing I'd like to add is about funding. Come back to the funding issue.
Yeah, I wanted to shift a little bit now
origins.
from that into some of the social and political aspects that came up, especially in the panel discussion.
You need to break down these silos, and it starts at school, because chemistry and biology are producing radically new disciplines for inventing vaccines and producing composites and making materials that compute. So we really need to challenge that in a new way. And by breaking down these boundaries, we're going to develop new technologies.
So go ahead.
And I think this might be really important for the Discovery Institute also. It's one thing for a private school like Harvard, but at Arizona State University, we have an origins center that studies origins from these purely materialistic perspectives. And in fact, I think I'm out of date here because it's been probably 10 years, but our anthropology department got changed to something like origin of human development or something like that. We don't even have anthropology anymore. But it's funding philosophical materialism and all of the religiousness that you hear in this. It's really fascinating to me that humans just can't avoid being religious, whether it's Richard Dawkins believing that the aliens did it or personalizing natural selection. They just can't avoid those things. And so this old division of saying, well, we're a private school or a public school, we're not going to fund religion. That's for a seminary. We're just going to fund science. Well, if you mean by that the development of technology, great. Or even scientific theories about how laws operate, great. But when you get into something about like the origin of those laws, you're really getting into these problems that all three of you have mentioned, because using the laws to explain their own origins has a self-referential contradiction in it. And it's different than just studying, say, gravity, but studying the origin of gravity really gets you into what we've all always called philosophy and religion. And so then for a state university, the question is, why would we use state funds to support that? And the answer is always that fallacy, Motte and Bailey fallacy, technological development. And it just doesn't follow, because the sciences doing technological development can do it perfectly fine without materialistic philosophical origin theories.
Yeah, and that was something that Peter Kraft was pressing in the panel at the end, around the 2-hour 28-minute mark of the video, and we'll put these clips in there.
But I think
about,
that
is it
pocketbook
utility
is
or
important.
is science in it for its own sake? So, Casey, there was this question that came up during the panel discussion, and one of the guys there was Randy Isaac, I think was his name, and he explicitly asked about Jim Tour's association with Discovery Institute, with Intelligent Design Advocates and Discovery Institute by name, and how some of Tour's work had been used there. So I mean, I don't know if we got you guys here, if you wanted to comment on that question by Isaac.
On your website,
other people,
that you do not agree with the intelligent design conclusion, yet your work is widely used by the Discovery Institute and many other creationist organizations as support for the view that the failure to have a naturalistic origin of life helps to support the idea of a creator. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, well, I absolutely believe in a creator, for sure, and I say that on my website. And in 6 days, God created the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. I don't know what the length of the day is, if we can quantify it based on our perspective today. But so I certainly believe in creation, and I'm very explicit on why I don't support the intelligent design directly. I say I'm sympathetic to it. It's just that I don't have a tool to assess design. Show me the data. And so if I can't generate data that says, yes, this is the signature of an intelligent design, I am not going to support that in the sense that, yes, this has been intelligently designed, because I don't have a metric for it. I say I'm sympathetic to it, but I don't have this metric. That's why I don't embrace intelligent design, although I'm sympathetic toward it. But if people take my written material and publish it in their papers, I can't restrict them. It's published. So I can't say, no, you can't publish it. I have no, that's up to them. So I've never given permission, and I've never denied permission. I use it.
Sure, Tony, I'd love to say a couple things. First, let me say Randy Isaac is a longtime friend and sort of colleague in the science-faith dialogue. He's been very involved with ASA, the American Scientific Affiliation, which is a Christian organization that tries to bring people of different viewpoints to have conversations about origins, other issues of science and faith. And Randy is a Christian, and I'm not in any way here to question his Christian commitment. And in fact, I've had some good interactions with him in the past. What was a little bit disheartening, or actually very disheartening actually, about that interaction with Jim Tour during the panel discussion is that Randy clearly wanted to make it look like we at Discovery Institute and those in the ID movement are disreputable. And if you affiliate yourself with us in any way or align yourself with us in any way, then you are a persona non grata. Now, what really struck me as ironic, and I don't think it's wrong for me to say this, because this was an invitation that Randy gave to me to a public event at ASA. He's actually invited Discovery Institute people to participate in ASA events in the past. But then when you're before an audience of academics at Harvard, you want to make it sound like, Discovery Institute is this disreputable organization that you should never affiliate with, or else you are the crazy one in the room, okay? And in that moment, there was a lot of pressure being put on Jim Tour to publicly disown any association with Discovery Institute before a live audience at Harvard, okay?
Yeah.
And so I think that was sort of intentional on Randy's part to try to make Jim look bad by having some connections to Discovery. Now, Jim has made it very clear that he is not supportive of intelligent design. I think Brian has made the point that, Jim is not necessarily hostile to us. He just is doing something different. He's out there trying to pose reasonable questions within his own area of expertise as a synthetic chemist to the origin of life field and challenging them to actually come up with reasonable scientific explanations. He's not doing intelligent design. That's fine. But, Jim does have various connections to us. I'm not saying that he supports ID, but Jim has spoken at our Dallas conference at Science and Faith. He contributed a wonderful chapter to an anniversary edition for the re-release of the book, The Mystery of Life's Origins. Brian has been on his podcast. We've interviewed him for our podcast. He's interfaced with Steve Meyer quite a bit. I interviewed Jim for our podcast a couple years ago, and we contributed to a volume with Jim, Science and Faith and Dialogue from South Africa a couple years ago. So, I mean, certainly we have lots of friendly associations with Jim behind the scenes, and we're very happy to do that. And I think he's very happy with that, and that's fine. Jim doesn't agree with everything we do, and he doesn't have to. Jim's his own man. We're not trying to claim that Jim agrees with everything we do. But I think what is interesting here is the rhetorical dynamic that was created in that moment by Dr. Isaac, who is a physicist, and I think he'd probably describe himself as a theistic evolutionist, to try to portray and posture ID as if it is this disreputable, Discovery Institute is this disreputable thing. If you have any connections to it, then you too are disreputable. And it shows the pressures that people face to disassociate themselves from intelligent design. In fact, in the great interview that Jim did with Hector Zanile later on, Jim actually talked about these pressures. And he said, this is what he said. He said, there is an establishment. It makes it very difficult on people who make these kinds of claims. He's talking about those who question the mainstream origin of life. And Jim, he said that he has had people reach out to him privately, sympathizing with what he's doing. But then he asked them to go on his channel. He says, quote, they don't want to go near my channel. So there is a lot of pressure. And we saw that pressure on display in the kind of, don't you dare associate with Discovery Institute. Don't you dare, when did you stop beating your wife kind of question that Randy Isaac posed to Jim Tor. But again, what's interesting is that behind the scenes, we have seen Randy Isaac actually asking Discovery Institute people to participate in ASA events. But when you're on stage before Harvard, all that goes out the window, and you have to act as if Discovery Institute is a bunch of crazy nutcases.
Well, boy, I mean, and I did want to bring this up. I mean, there was sort of a very political, sort of social kind of in the atmosphere there in the air. And I don't know who Randy Isaac is from The Man in the Moon. I'm just watching the debate because I know what Jim Tor has been doing, and I'm curious. I thought Randy Isaac was a dyed-in-the-wool, atheistic materialist, alongside with Cronin and others, and this was a sort of the typical kind of attack that we've seen done before on Discovery Institute by your scientists who are beholden to methodological and even metaphysical naturalism, like a Lawrence Krauss type thing. So I would not have pegged him just from what was captured on camera, as a Christian or a theist even.
It's very interesting,
so that's
that
interesting you point that out. Yeah.
It's very interesting that you had that perception, Tony, because he definitely is a Christian. He definitely does not support ID. He's critical of ID. Brian has had dialogues with him where Randy has criticized ID. So have I. I was at an ASA event where he was critical of ID and I defended ID. I was there at Randy's invitation. And so, but he probably would say he's a theistic evolutionist, but you can see that even folks from the Christian perspective sometimes want to try to enforce this sort of suppression of the intelligent design viewpoint through certain social pressures.
Well, and that is something that I do. And I mean, this is somewhere this frustrates. I grew up with academics. My, father was the department chair of engineering at Notre Dame, electrical engineering. And I mean, in those technical fields, maybe not so much, but when you get into these issues, these fields that do touch on the philosophy and theology and have religious implications, I really frustrates me this. In private, I do this, but then when I'm in public, I do something different. I mean, I know that sometimes, I don't know, that caving into that kind of pressure, it bothers me. It bothers me at a deep level. But thank you for clarifying that, at least, because again, he and people can watch the clip. It explicitly mentions Tor's association with Discovery Institute. So thanks.
You think we will figure it out.
Yes.
But it was a very brief statement. So just to be clear, so you do believe, like, in the end, there's a naturalistic explanation for the emergence of life?
Yeah, I think that we're going to see, just like I'm using the analogy of the genetic code, where we're going to go, oh, Lord, that's how you did it.
And at the dinner table conversation, at the panel discussion, I mean, when the word God comes up, people just, I mean, they brace right there. But, with Jim Tor, The thing is, sometimes you can get away with mentioning God generically, just the term God, because people can fill in God with all kinds of content. They can fill it in subjectively, whatever they want. But, you know, Tour gets up there and he talks about Jesus Christ. I mean, he's laying it out there. He's talking about my Lord and Savior Jesus. So, I mean, he's very explicit. He's very courageous in that sense. I find him very bold.
Yeah, but I think that it does
I mean,
affect the way that we think about, because I think we all know at this point the myth of the scientist who's just an objective person studying science,
neutral viewpoint.
So we're all past that. And that's one important thing that we've come to understand through really postmodern critiques. Have made us see the human element.
I would say it goes before that. I think Thomas Kuhn and his Structure of Scientific Revolution show that bias is a leading indicator in all of this.
Sure, yeah. Right. Well, that'd be part of the postmodern critique. But the spiritual side of it is so important. I think Casey just got that, which is your relationship to God comes into it. You have one way or the other.
Yeah.
Nature does reveal God. And so if you have this negative relationship with God, you're going to want to cover that up and not pay attention to it. And that's a factor even with scientists.
One thing I wanted to mention about Tour too, that he's really demonstrating a bit of humility, because he says, I'm not an intelligent design advocate. I'm sympathetic, but this is not my thing. And I think that's really helpful, because it's an issue of expertise in many ways. Because when you're looking at design in biology or nature in general, you're not using the same toolkit or the same methods as you would look at, let's say, a chemical reaction. And that's important. And Jim Tour has never criticized us. He's never said we're pseudoscientists. He's never opposed us. He just says, that's not my thing. I'm working in this framework. I'm playing by the rules of the Secular Academy, and that's my thing. And you go do your thing, and I trust you, what you're doing on that. And I think it's interesting. You see the same thing in biology at large, because when you look at the design conversation, who controls it? It's people who don't have the expertise to really address it. They're not engineers. They've been trained to see the world through this materialist grid, so they assume on faith that there's no evidence of design, and then they find various reasons to justify that belief. In contrast, what you're seeing in biology is really a revolution that's at its earliest stages, because engineers are working more and more with biologists. And what you're seeing is when they do that, they use design language, they use design assumptions. It's really quite remarkable. In fact, one paper I just wanted to mention, it's called A Survey of Engineering Models for Systems Biology. And it's by Gregory Reeves and Curtis Hirschach. And my understanding is one is a systems biologist and the other is an engineer. And what they talk about is how the cell looks like an embedded computing system. You don't just simply see the same mechanisms like information processing, error correction, but you see even the same overarching design logic. So what happens is when engineers work with biologists, what they see is it's not a God of the gaps, but it's the evidence pointing to not just design, but the same design logic humans use, but at a much higher level. So I think we're seeing the pendulum in a very slight way starting to switch away from this materialist Epicurean assumption back towards the design perspective.
No, I would agree. And I haven't read this book, but I know Rob Coons wrote several years ago now, Owen, when he wrote the book, The Waning of Materialism.
Yeah.
Well, I think it was an edited volume, correct? Yeah. But, and this is where I think, we've talked to another, where is that evidence going to lead people? A lot of times it's going to land people and, into something more like an imminent sort of view of causation and even
it's
maybe
basically what we call in my field
yeah.
process theology.
Process
materialism.
Right. Yeah.
Hey everyone, I have to run. I'm afraid.
Okay, Owen.
It's been great to meet you all. I hope we can talk again.
Yeah.
Good to see you, Owen.
Yeah, thank you all for your insights. They're marvelous. Hopefully I'll see you soon.
We will. Thanks, Owen. Steve?
Yeah, what you asked earlier, Tony, about Randy Isaac's question, and pressing Tour, as Casey was pointing out. And a couple of thoughts. First is, and one way, I love the question. I love that at an exclusive origin of life debate at Harvard. That clearly,
which is Harvard has also been in the news recently, by the way, for many other things.
But that ID is in the back of the room. I think that's significant. there is no need to cast any aspersions on astrologers or flat earthers. They don't pose a threat. So I think it's flattering, frankly, that the question came up. And I do also think there's a delicious irony here. I saw from Cronin and others clear worries about God of the gaps, a strong commitment to methodological naturalism. And yet at the same time, if I think we take his methodologically naturalistic orientation seriously, he ends up doing the very thing he's worried about. He's worried about ID and creationism because he thinks they're fundamentally anti-science, and they'll bring science to a close, to an end. You'll insert God as a cover for ignorance. It'll later be discovered that there's a natural cause and so on. But the irony is under MN, and I think under his project, is natural explanation, the ones you ever consider as a category of what counts as a valid explanation. So no matter what the data are now, no matter what the data are in the future, as a category, naturalistic explanations will always be the leading choice you have. And of course, I think that's interesting because one of the elements that came up was falsifiability and the lack of falsifiability. Natural theories as a category are, on that view, unfalsifiable. I remember one time when I was attending a conference as a graduate student, a gentleman gave a paper in which he was critiquing ID because he said it was unfalsifiable, and he thought we should only have naturalistic explanations in science. And yeah, I was a graduate student with the EQ that young graduate students like myself had. So I asked in Q&A, well, then our natural theories as a category, are those falsifiable? And that really caught his attention because the answer was clearly no. But think about, so in the practical way this played out in this debate, remember when Kreef asked the question, well, suppose in a few hundred years, we send out space probes and we realize that there's only life on Earth. This was in response to some of the table talk that life may be inevitable. Its development may be inevitable.
Right.
Suppose there's only life one place in the universe that we know of on Earth. And the response to Kreef's question was fascinating. Cronin immediately said that we can't rule out that there's life somewhere else or that there's very different kinds of life.
Right. Yeah.
So in other words, on his view, to falsify his naturalistic orientation or assembly theory or whatever requires critics to prove a universal negative, that there's literally no other life of any kind anywhere in the universe.
Right. You'd have to search every location in the universe.
That effectively makes it completely unfalsifiable, which means you get to ignore the evidence we have in the present.
For the alternatives. Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And in effect, you become the very anti-science disposition that you're worried about by virtue of what, regardless of the evidence, current, past, present, or future, you limit yourself to an overly narrow range of explanatory options. And keep in mind, this is all in the context when Cronin's own explanation of his view required invoking agentive language.
Right. And and that's one of the reasons I support the Discovery Institute, because I think methodological naturalism, or the beholdenness to it as a dogma, is just terribly, it hinders the scientific project. It hinders the intellectual project, more broadly, the curiosity that we have about the nature of things. So, okay, let's stay on that briefly though. But then, is there a place to keep some modified form of methodological naturalism?
Yeah, in the sense that methodological naturalism wants you to have science that is reliable and predictable and testable. I think that those are good aspects of methodological naturalism. I think, though, that when methodological naturalism says that the only explanations that can be reliable or predictable or testable are those which invoke purely naturalistic, mechanistic causes, I think that's where it sort of adds a superfluous condition that is not necessary. You can have reliability, predictability, and testability through, non-naturalistic or non-materialistic causes like intelligence.
Right.
And so in that respect, I think that methodological naturalism highlighted some aspects of science we want to have, but ultimately it adds a condition that is sort of superfluous and unnecessary in order to have those reliability, predictability that we want to have in science.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole field of science that works on the idea of intelligent agents in biology, and that's forensic science. That's exactly what they do. They distinguish between natural causes and intended causes or agent-based causes for things like death or any other thing. And so I think it's a little dishonest to say that, you can't posit intelligent agents or that's not real science, because just in that aspect, we do have good ways of determining the difference between those two kinds of ideas.
Brian?
I think an analogy I'd like to use, I use this with James Tour in his podcast, that's really helpful to clarify this. And I'll preface it by saying a fundamental misunderstanding of biology is they see it as a science no different from chemistry or astronomy or geology, but really biology is reverse engineering a technology far more advanced than ourselves. That's what it is. So when people talk about, a lot of the language people use, a lot of the conversation is a category error. And to use an analogy why that's important, imagine that people find a crashed spaceship near Area 51 in the United States, and two groups of scientists and researchers want to study it. And one says, I'm going to assume this only happened through natural processes, that the spaceship is simply a product of physical laws and chemistry. And they go about looking at, let's say, how it could have happened. Maybe volcanoes could have produced molten metals, which fell into the cracks of rocks and turned into spaceship parts. And then tornadoes brought these spaceship parts together to form a spaceship. Now, obviously, that research program would go nowhere, and that's where the origin of life is. Versus people that are engineers saying, well, maybe the spaceship isn't a product of natural processes, but it's designed. And now suddenly you bring in engineers, you try to reverse engineer it, you look at logical similarities with our design, and you would make enormous progress. And that's exactly what you see in life, is that there's no question that life did not happen naturally if you're just looking at the evidence. If you read Stephen Benner's paper I mentioned, he believes it had to be natural, but he acknowledges that all the evidence suggests that couldn't have happened naturally. This idea of self-replicating molecules is completely implausible, because Casey talked about the challenge of having the information in one molecule. But when you look at origin of life research with RNAs that quote unquote self-replicate, you've got to have literally trillions of copies of those copying molecules in a liter of water, or else the breakdown of the molecules would be faster than their ability to replicate themselves. And there is no way you can imagine that a trillion polymerases occurred in the same liter of water on the early Earth. That is completely implausible. And other origin of life researchers have pointed this out. The other issue is self-organization, because I talked about how that's the other demigod. And everyone who talks about origin of life and self-organization references Jeremy England. He was the most popular figure. He had a lot of news press. He's a physicist from MIT who then moved, I believe, to Georgia Tech. I had a very nice exchange with Jeremy England, and he acknowledged that no evidence supports the view that the sort of research he does could help any specific stage of the origin of life. Because and I apologize for getting a little in the details, but this is important. Self-organizational processes happen when you've got an energy source that's properly matched to a system. The heat of the sun causes air to expand, which changes its velocity, which creates a funnel cloud. It's matched. But there's no energy source on the early Earth that's properly matched to useful biochemical reactions. So the energy on the early Earth cannot self-organize a cell, because all it will do is break apart a half-formed cell into simple molecules. So the science is not complex, it's not ambiguous. But because people refuse to consider design, they have to keep going through the same research over and over again that doesn't really lead anyplace. In contrast, when you look at the cell from an engineering perspective, you see indisputable evidence of design, not just in the generic sense of molecules with information, specified complexity, but in the specific sense that you look at a cell and it has the same design logic we use to a large extent, the same hierarchy of systems and subsystems with tight constraints, but it just does it better and more sophisticated than what we do. So I would argue there really is no debate if you're willing to step outside of the realm of scientific materialism and just put on the design glasses even for a moment. That's where we are.
Right. Right. Excellent. That's great. That's great. So I want to then move to sort of kind of wrapping up some thoughts and pulling together some threads on what happened there in November 28th at Harvard. So I think it's safe to say that, I mean, the things that Cronin talked about in his talk, and then of course at the dinner table and also the panel discussion, I mean, it's safe to say he didn't really address Tour's challenges, right? Those were not addressed. Those challenges that Jim Tour has issued still remain, right, unaddressed, right? There was a lot of talk about rhetoric and Jim Tour's personality and being too aggressive and sort of can't we all sort of get along and make progress together as scientists. One of the things then that I want to ask you guys here as we wrap up is, I mean, we've talked about the philosophical presuppositions that maybe are driving this, but I mean, is Tour really pointing out some kind of systemic problems in this area of research? And, and what can one do about that?
Has the public been misled on the origin of life claims? Well, 1/3 of the public, and this is 80% of this public, had a college education, some level of college education, college degree. 1/3 of the general public thinks that scientists have made frogs in their lab just by putting molecules together and built frogs. 2/3 of the general public think that scientists have made bacteria in their lab, a bacterium. Both of those are false, in case you didn't know. Well, because there's mixed messaging from origin of life researchers. Professor Cronin at a TED Talk in 2011 said, "What I'm going to try to do in the next 15 minutes or so is tell you about an idea of how we're going to make matter come alive." After the talk, Chris Anderson said, "Just a quick question on timeline. When you believe you're going to be successful in this? When?" Lee Cronin, "Hopefully within the next 2 years." That was in 2011. So we're about 10 years overdue, and maybe Lee is going to tell us about this life today. Is it any wonder that the public has been misled on the current state of origin of life proposals? Who, perchance, might have misled them?
If there's, I guess what I'm getting at is, I don't want to necessarily use the word corruption. Corruption is maybe too strong, maybe not. I don't know. If it's just a philosophical lens that needs to be shifted, but I mean, how does Tours challenge the origin of life community? What do you guys think it'll do in the near future, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I do have some sympathy, a little bit, for Cronin's view, at least as I understand it, or I should say some sympathy for an element of his view. I think he believes that we'll solve the origin of life eventually by a reference to purely natural processes, and it seems like Jim thinks that may happen as well. So I think in Cronin's view, there's a little bit of maybe a sense of, Jim, would you stop annoying us? We both think that this will be solved with in due course. We think there will be natural explanations that are sufficient. Suppose I started a research program in science, I won't. And 5 years into it, Casey shows up at my doorstep and tells me all the things that are, all the explanatory deficits.
I would never do that to you, Steve.
You would never do that to me. But he thinks fundamentally, we both agree fundamentally that the types of explanations that I'm seeking will be found. I think from Cronin's perspective, it's like, yes, I think you're right, Tony, that he hasn't met the challenges that Jim has laid out. And I also think at some level, he thinks it's premature or inappropriate to keep hammering on these challenges when this is a nascent, from his view, when this is a nascent discipline, when we have lots of decades and even centuries to go on it, and which science itself, in his view, is actually a fairly new enterprise. So I have some sympathy. I have some sympathy with his. I think feeling annoyed.
Okay, yeah.
or pestered.
Well, Tours,
but I
look,
do.
Tours
then let me just
strongly.
finish the point
Like,
here.
yeah.
But I think you're quite right that what animates it in his case is this materialist commitment.
Yeah.
And one is entitled to a materialist commitment. But I do think that those of us who are listeners, we should get to hear at some point what that materialist commitment is built on. It's not built on origin of life data. That's clear enough, because there's the concession that these problems are unexplained. So what is it built on? And is that materialist commitment and the grounds for it, is that commitment and its justification strong enough to continue to adopt a materialistic point of view about science generally, about the origin of life, in the face of the data we see of specified complexity, of incredible engineering feats, as Brian, whatever your materialist commitment is, it better have really excellent justification in the face of the current scientific data we have. And that's what's not clear. And that's what was not even addressed fully. Kreeft was nicely getting after it.
Yeah.
But there's more to dig there.
Yeah. Brian?
There's a really nice book out. It's called The Trouble with Physics by Lee Smolin. And he's a physicist, and he's talking about how this whole conversation about Tour and Cronin is not unique to Origin of Life. A concern that this physicist pointed out was that there tends to be political insiders in science, and they're able to direct funds in a certain direction where other people that might have more valid approaches will be left out. Let me use the example of string theory versus quantum loop gravity. One of the biggest challenges in physics is how do you combine general relativity, which talks about the very large, massive gravitational fields, and the very small, which is quantum mechanics. It's a hard problem. It's an unsolved problem. And a large proportion of the funding has gone to string theory, which is basically taking particle physics and then trying to add gravity as an afterthought. And what happens is people in other fields, like quantum loop gravity, that start from another premise, are pointing out that this is not very productive. It's not doing much. It's not making predictions. So we think our framework deserves a little more funding. That's the logic. So what Tour is pointing out is the approach, the fundamental approach of what origin of life researchers are doing. We take incredibly complex, sophisticated chemical protocols to produce a molecule that be produced for life. He's saying that fundamental approach is not helpful. He says, if you want to do real research on the origin of life, you need to address this problem of information. You need to address this issue of assembly. So he's saying real research needs to focus on these fields and stop exaggerating your results. And he has had an impact. There are now research papers coming out saying, you know, we really need to not make these extravagant claims. We really need to recognize that if we're dealing with origin of life, the conditions need to be more realistic. So he is already making a positive impact. But I want to answer the question that the physicist, the physicist whose name I forget, asked at the dinner table. How would you use the money? Well, I'll tell you.
Right.
I'll tell you exactly how I'd use the money. I would pour research into engineers working with biologists, because that research produces real results. You gain real insights about how life operates. You gain real technology, like Stuart Burgess is copying the engineering design of life and applying it to things like prosthetic limbs. I would say that's the future of biology that's going to be productive.
No, that's good. That's good. Thanks for putting an end point on that, because that question did come up a couple times, and especially at the end. If you did have the money, what what would you put it into? Where is going to be the productive project here in this origin of life? Casey, let's finish up with you. Origin of life issues. I mean, one question I always try and ask, because this is a podcast on theology and ethics, and you know, we're trying to connect some of these higher level discussions going on in the culture, especially in the academy, with the church. Origin of life, how does this relate to, you know, I mean, Tor even spoke about, you know, hey, I have these Christians coming up to me and they're wondering if, you know, these people are just in the tank. They're just corrupt. They just don't want God in the picture. And he's saying, no, I don't think these scientists are waking up in the morning and trying to like, how can I exclude God from my scientific endeavors today? But speak to the relevance of this issue as it applies to the church living in the culture that we are right now. I mean, that's a big question, but how is this relevant? How is this pertinent to the life of the church right now?
Oh my, I don't know if I have a lot to say on that. I was going to give you a summary of a series of blog posts that I've written about the Tour
do that
Cronin
then
Roundtable, but this probably isn't what you're looking for here, Tony. I apologize for that. I mean, my background is in the sciences. When I talk about suppressing the truth, I think that it is actually the same dynamic that we see. Owen mentioned the famous historian of science, Thomas Kuhn, and he talked about how scientists tend to be intolerant of new ideas. I think, Lenny, you also mentioned that scientists tend to be intolerant of new ideas that challenge reigning paradigms. And I think that we see that at work in the origin of life paradigm. Although, yeah, it is a boutique field. It is a small field. Cronin might argue we've got a long ways to go. That's fine. But this is a field that's been around for, it's been multiple decades, probably close to 100 years since Oparin first put forth this hypothesis that life arose in a little pond somewhere. And that was also Darwin's view. People have been working on these questions for a long time. And Jim Tour would say that we are really no closer to answering how basic biomolecules arose, than we were. Well, we were a little bit closer, but we really still cannot explain how fundamental biomolecules arose. So I want to read just the summary about this roundtable that I'm going to be posting on a series of blogs on Evolution News very soon. Is that okay, Tony? And I think this is
I didn't want to put you on the spot there, but I didn't mention this at the outset, but the organization that put this debate on, I believe, was called like the Cambridge Roundtable for Science and Religion. I think it was in the title. So I mean, it wasn't the debate wasn't just about science, and Randy Isaacs brought that up. It was also about religion. So
well, and I have a secondary story that I can kind of more answer your question once Casey's
let's Casey talk about the blogs that you're going to put up, and then we'll let Lenny tell that story.
All right. No, I'll keep this brief. I'm really interested in science communication and how we can understand, in these complex debates that are going on before the public, how can a non-expert sort through what the different experts on different sides are saying and find out who has a better argument? It can be a real challenge. And a few years ago, somebody sent me an email titled War of Words, and they wanted to ask this question: how can I tell which expert is right when I see different experts with very strong opinions, but yet diametrically opposed views? It's very difficult to sort through the science. And I said, look, I sympathize with that. Even though I have a PhD in science and I've studied a lot of these topics, it can be very difficult to do that. And so sometimes you can look at the rhetorical dynamics of a conversation and see who has the better argument. So this is how I would title my post, Another War of Words, Reflections on the Tour Cronin Roundtable at Harvard. In November 2023, Rice chemistry professor James Tour and University of Glasgow chemistry professor Lee Cronin had a roundtable on the origin of life at Harvard, hosted by the Cambridge Faculty on Science and Religions. There were far fewer fireworks than Tour's previous debate against YouTuber Dave Farina, held at Rice University in May of 2023, but the rhetorical dynamics were strikingly similar. Tour spent most of the evening talking about the science, focusing on chemical obstacles to producing polypeptides, polynucleotides, polysaccharides, specified information, or how to assemble these components into a, quote, integrated functional living systems under natural Earth-like conditions. While Cronin was far more civil and congenial than Dave Farina, Cronin nonetheless resembled Farina in that he spent an inordinate amount of time talking about Jim Tour and Jim Tour's alleged faults. This was included making some strange Accusations over and over again that Tor was shouting, or Tor was being overcritical, or saying that Tor was claiming, quote, everyone's an idiot, or that Tor called, quote, Cronin, quote, a bad chemist. Simply put, none of this happened. Tor didn't shout. He didn't call anyone an idiot. He never called Cronin a bad chemist or attacked Cronin's scientific competency. And Tor's scientific questions and challenges were entirely reasonable. Cronin's rhetorical strategy seemed designed to distract people from the fact that he had zero. And if we go by Cronin's statements during the event, I mean absolutely zero answers to Tor's questions about how key biomolecules arose on the early Earth. Instead, Cronin sought to use his charismatic personality to convince people that we're making progress on the origin of life, such as they might have faith to believe that someday it will be solved. Perhaps it will be, perhaps it won't be, but Cronin gave us no indication what that solution might look like. Cronin did discuss assembly theory, but spoke in vague metaphors and never tackled the chemistry of how life might have arisen on the early Earth. So Cronin's performance during the roundtable showed that he had zero answers to Jim Tor's questions about how life might have formed naturally, and this helps you know who had the better argument in this quote-unquote war of words. And that's all I have to say about that.
All right, there you go. There's the summation. We didn't even need to do the 2 hours of podcasting here. We could have just had you read that, but that's great. Okay, that was clear. I mean, Jim Tor's challenge again it still remains, you know, a challenge to the whole community.
Could I share the relevance? Could I share the relevance of why this matters? And I'll speak
please.
very personally, because
And I have a comment on that too after Brian and Lenny.
Oh, great. Okay, good. Yeah, go ahead. Brian.
It's dangerously naive to believe this question of design is not relevant to the average person. It's just more of a philosophical question. When I went to MIT undergraduate as someone who was a Christian, but I became fairly convinced through the science that I wasn't deliberately created by God, but I was an unintended accident. I read Richard Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker. I was exposed to these other ideas. And I said, okay, well, if I'm an unintended accident, then most likely God doesn't exist and I have no purpose in life. And that threw me into Great Depression. I was paralyzed. And I said, God, I don't know if you exist, but if you do exist, well, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to prove it to me. I'm a scientist. That's just the way it is. And just through God's divine intervention, I just met the right people at the right time. I met the Philip Johnson. I met people like Craig Keener, who helped me with other issues. I met people like Michael Behe. And what happened is I realized that the science didn't suggest I was an accident, but that I was actually designed. And that created the philosophical space for me to consider the truth of the faith again. And I came back to faith. And I have countless examples of that. But at a practical level, design will help propel science. The denial of design will retract science. Let me talk about a very practical example, agriculture. We are destroying the soil because people assumed that that plants were not designed. They were just in competition with other organisms. And as a result, what we really need to do is just kill weeds, add fertilizers, and life is good. But that's destroyed the soil because the soil ecosystem is incredibly complex. And you have soils that send out signals to bacteria to come and help alter the ecosystem. You've got filaments, networks of fungi that act as communication channels where trees can warn each other about predators. So because we did not assume design and that we were smarter than nature, we're destroying our agricultural system. But it's a design perspective that can help save agriculture by applying engineering principles and logic to help deal with plants the way that God intended. If you look at everything from medicine, people assume the human body wasn't designed. So it must have lots of bad designs. The knee is poorly designed. We've got this appendix that doesn't work. So what do people do? They cut out the appendix. Well, guess what? It's part of the immune system. So what you find is this denial of design has hindered our medical system from doing the most effective treatments by cooperating with the way that our bodies are designed. And I could include countless examples of why the knowledge of design can help us spiritually, give us confidence in our faith, but also help society by advancing biology more effectively and helping to create better technology by borrowing the designs from life and using them ourselves.
Excellent points, Brian. Excellent. Yeah, I mean, if there's one thing I think we really need to awaken to, especially in the West, is that things things are designed to include our bodies.
So my
Yeah.
my thought is,
Yeah.
first of all, we have to realize that the church has, for many decades, and somewhat not unwarranted, been criticized for not understanding where modern science has made advancements, uncovered certain things. There's kind of a fundamentalist, supposedly, reaction of, well, you guys go and do your thing. I'm just going to ignore it. I'm not even going to learn what these new advancements are, stick my head in the sand kind of thing. And that's been a criticism that's been laid at the feet of pastors and others, since the fundamentalist movement and possibly even before. Right. However, at the same time, as Brian has mentioned and others, there's almost a similar movement in reverse in the scientific community. Now, I recently had an interview with Dr. Seigart, who tells his story. Here's a man who comes from a communist atheist family. He describes himself as a militant atheist. He went to school, studied the science, and he understood that the science was the thing that had answers. That was his presupposition. As he got into the weeds of it, as he's a PhD biochemist, worked at the National Institutes for Health. So he's credentialed well. And as he studied it, he started to find out, no, you know what? There's just as many mysteries in the science. There's just as many questions in the science as there has been for some of these other factors. And it opened up his mind, first of all, to the idea that science doesn't have all the answers, that it doesn't sum everything up into nice, neat little boxes. And that allowed him to start an investigation, which, along with some other aspects of his life, led him to basically a belief in God very late in life. Maybe, I think 49 was he first starts believing. Doesn't get baptized till he's 65 years old, which is just amazing. But my point is, to the pastor who may have stuck with us this far and said, all of this is just intellectual, ping pong. We're just, what does it matter? Well, it matters to individuals who are lost. It matters to these people who need to know that science isn't that much of a threat when you explore its deep recesses. If everybody understood the vagaries in the science and the things that we don't know, it does leave room for issues of faith. And I think we, to our detriment, ignore that on the church side.
Well, that's a great story. And I tell you, that's why the exaggerations that Tour was calling out were so frustrating to hear about, right? Steve, I'm gonna give you the last word, and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay. Thanks, Tony, and thanks for pulling all this together. It's been a fascinating conversation. I feel like we could keep going. Your viewers might be fatigued, but sitting here is fantastic. So thank you for pulling all this together. Yeah, just a couple of comments thinking about the Cronin Tour debate as a whole, and I say these final comments as not a representative of Discovery Institute per se, but more as on a kind of personal level. The first is, your question was, how does this matter to the church? And I'm a Christian enthusiastically so. So I'd say a few things. The first is, it's important for Christians to see that, as Del Ratch nicely puts it, science has a serious, incurable case of the humans. It's like any enterprise.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean we should be suspicious of it. It just means we should understand it. And we should understand whether conclusions that are promoted by scientists are really driven by the data or driven by deeper philosophical commitments. Those may be actually good commitments, or they may not. But we want to tease apart what the data say and what the underlying commitments are, and then ask questions. What are the grounds for those deeper commitments, and are they justified? I'd say a second lesson is, for those who have deep religious convictions, say deep Christian convictions, to not be overly deferential to mainstream scientific proclamations about what is so-and-so. One ought to be attentive. One ought to take those claims seriously, but to really look at the evidence on one's own in a significant way, because sometimes the stated conclusions really are way over the skis of the data themselves. And there is a tendency, I think, even by some professional theologians and biblical scholars, to be overly deferent towards, say, Darwinian biologists or others. And you rarely see it in the opposite direction.
Right.
And I think we should just be careful. And whatever beliefs one has, one ought to check one's warrant, whatever beliefs that are offered to one, to check the warrant, the justification seriously. The third element is what's exciting, I think, about a design approach is there's really a new narrative of the history and the trajectory of science. As Brian's emphasized, science is so beautifully intelligible from a design perspective. And that's the way modern science has arisen. If you look back at the pioneers, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Copernicus, they had a deep, deep understanding of a mind-first view of the natural world. So the narrative of science has always been mind-first. It's always been deeply oriented to design. And the trajectory and the case for design has just gotten stronger over time. If you have that view, then you won't flinch when you hear things that Cronin and others say that turns out are not well justified by the evidence. You'll see those as anomalies, which they are, and you'll be able to have a fair-minded assessment of them. And that, I think, will open ones up to taking the data seriously on its own terms and not being caught up in something simply because it's mainstream.
Great point, Steve. Thanks again. Well, look, this has been an excellent conversation, gentlemen. I will encourage everybody to go watch the debate for themselves and review everything that we've talked about here. It was such a interesting conversation touching on science, philosophy, sociology, politics. So it just seemed to me one of those events that, we really had to dive into, and I think we've done a great job here, and I appreciate you guys all being here today to do this with us. So thanks again for your participation, and if there's another debate at Harvard down the line, I look forward to getting you all together again. So thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah,
okay.
Thanks, Tony.
God bless.
It was fun. Wednesday morning quarterbacking is always fun, Tony. Thanks for having us.
That's right.
To close on a congenial note, I agree with Professor Cronin. Origin of life research is a scam. Thank you.